I thought I was the last person in the room to know. At a quiet steakhouse out west, my wife and her boss switched languages like I wasn't there. They laughed. They planned. They assumed I didn't understand a word. What they missed was simple. I wasn't confused. I was listening. For the first 3 years of my marriage, everything looked reasonable. Not passionate, not dramatic, just orderly, predictable. The kind of life people nod at and say, "That's what adulthood looks like." I was a reliable husband. I showed up. I paid the bills on time. I didn't ask many questions, because I believed questions were for people who didn't trust each other. And trust, I thought, was something grown men were supposed to have by default. Lauren had a demanding job, long hours, sudden trips, calendar blocks that filled up weeks in advance. It all sounded legitimate. Corporate language always does. When she said she'd be late, she had a reason. When money moved between accounts, there was an explanation. When she seemed distant, there was a story that made sense if you didn't look too closely. And I didn't look too closely, because I believed something very strongly back then, that mature relationships don't survive on suspicion. They survive on restraint, on patience, on choosing not to interrogate every odd detail. So when things felt off, I told myself I was being dramatic. When conversations shortened, I blamed stress. When affection became scheduled instead of spontaneous, I told myself, that's just what happens after the honeymoon phase. I was proud of how calm I was. I thought that calm made me strong. What I didn't understand was that there's a difference between being calm and being quiet about things that matter. Looking back now, the signs weren't loud. They were almost polite. A work trip that landed on the same days every month. Expenses that came from our joint account but never quite lined up with what we'd planned. Gifts she bought for herself that I never saw her wear around me. None of it was explosive enough to confront. Each detail, on its own, was harmless. That's how these things survive. Not through one big lie, but through 1,000 small ones that are too reasonable to challenge. And I didn't challenge them, because I thought being a good man meant giving people the benefit of the doubt. I thought love meant absorbing discomfort quietly, so no one else had to feel it. I thought endurance was the same thing as loyalty. It took me a long time to admit this. But here's the truth. My marriage didn't start breaking when the betrayal happened. It started breaking when I became the only one doing the emotional labor of keeping it intact. There's a concept I learned much later, after everything fell apart. Psychologists call it moral asymmetry. It's what happens when one person keeps playing by ethical rules, while the other quietly stops. The good person believes honesty will fix things, believes patience will be rewarded, believes if they stay calm and reasonable, the truth will eventually surface on its own. The manipulative person doesn't need to be cruel. They just need to wait. They wait for your doubt. They wait for your hesitation. They wait for you to talk yourself out of what you're noticing. And because you don't want to be unfair, you end up being unprotected. That was me. I wasn't blind. I was disciplined into silence by my own values. I believed that questioning too much would damage the relationship. I never considered that not questioning at all might destroy it. There were moments I remember clearly now. Times I almost said something, almost asked a follow-up, almost pulled out a statement and did the math. And every time I stopped myself. I told myself, real adults don't keep score. Real adults don't assume the worst. Real adults don't turn their marriages into investigations. What no one tells you is this: people who exploit trust depend on you believing that. They depend on your patience. They depend on your desire to be fair. They depend on you being more afraid of conflict than of the truth. My marriage didn't collapse because I was naive. It collapsed because I was committed to being reasonable in a situation that required clarity. There are relationships that don't fall apart from one catastrophic moment. They erode quietly because one person keeps absorbing inconsistencies and calling it maturity. I thought I was choosing peace. In reality, I was choosing delay. And delay, when someone else is acting in bad faith, is not neutral. It's permission. It took me years to understand that being kind without boundaries isn't kindness. It's exposure. You don't lose in these situations because you're weak. You lose because you're playing a cooperative game while the other person has already switched strategies. I didn't need to become cruel. I didn't need to become paranoid. I just needed to stop confusing silence with strength. And by the time I finally stopped ignoring that difference, everything I thought I knew about my marriage was already standing on borrowed time. After that dinner started, I didn't explode. I didn't stand up. I didn't throw a glass. I didn't do any of the things people expect a man to do when his pride gets cut open in public. I just did what I'd always done. I stayed calm. And on the outside, that probably looked like strength. But on the inside, something clicked into place. Something cold. Something clear. Because once you hear the truth, once you recognize it, you stop needing to argue with your own instincts. The next morning, I woke up like I had to go to work. Same routine, same shower, same coffee, same quiet house. Lauren was already gone. A text on the counter, long day, meetings, love you. 3 words at the end that used to mean something. Now they read like punctuation. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open and my hands flat on the wood. Just breathing. Not because I was trying to calm down. Because I was trying not to do anything stupid. People think the most dangerous part of betrayal is the moment you find out. It's not. The most dangerous part is what you do in the first 24 hours after. That's when you want to burn the whole thing down. That's when you want to confront, to demand explanations, to force a confession. And that's exactly what manipulative people count on. They don't fear your anger. They fear your accuracy. So I didn't confront. I didn't accuse. I didn't ask questions I already knew I wouldn't get honest answers to. I started gathering, quietly, like an adult, like a man who understood that feelings don't hold up in court. But timelines do. I pulled up our joint account first. It was something I rarely did. Not because I couldn't. Because I trusted her. Because in our marriage, she handled the money and I handled everything else. There were pages of normal transactions, groceries, utilities, insurance, subscriptions we'd forgotten we even had. And then there were patterns, not dramatic at first, just consistent. Charges that hit on the same weekday, around the same time. A hotel deposit here, a nice dinner there, a boutique store I didn't recognize. A rideshare receipt across town on a day she'd told me she was working late. You can explain one of those away. You can't explain 18 of them in a row. I made a list. Not in my head. On paper. Dates. Amounts. Locations. I cross-checked against her work calendar the shared one she insisted was just for organization. Meetings with Marcus Hale. Off-site calls. Client dinner. Project review. Always framed like responsibility. Always framed like sacrifice. But here's what's funny about lies. They often require organization. And organized lies leave tracks. By noon, I had 3 months mapped out. By evening, I had a year. And the more I wrote, the more I realized this wasn't a messy mistake. This was scheduled. This was built. It was designed to feel like nothing. That night, I went a step further. I checked statements for anything that looked like paperwork, legal fees, document services, notarizations, anything that didn't belong in a normal month. That's when I saw it. A charge from a firm I didn't recognize. Not huge, just enough to slide under the radar if you weren't paying attention. I copied the name into a search bar. Trust and estate. That phrase sat there on the screen like a warning sign you only notice when you're already about to crash. Trust and estate. Why would we have anything to do with that? We weren't wealthy. Not like that. We weren't setting up generational money or family foundations. Unless someone else was. I looked again at the date of that charge. Then I looked at the other expenses around it. It wasn't random. It sat right in the middle of a cluster: hotel deposits, restaurant bills, a jewelry store, a private medical clinic. I didn't need to be a detective to understand what that kind of cluster meant. Someone was planning something. And for the first time, I felt something that wasn't heartbreak. It was a kind of sick respect for the scale of it. Because affairs happen. People are weak. People get selfish. People make dumb choices. But this had infrastructure. This had paperwork. This had a budget. This had a timeline. I remember sitting back in my chair, staring at my notes, and thinking, how long? Not how long have they been sleeping together? How long have they been building a version of my life that didn't include my consent? How long have they been using my calm as cover? My phone buzzed. A message from Lauren. Can you pick up a bottle of wine tonight? We should have a quiet dinner. Just us. I read it twice. Then I set the phone face down and kept writing. Because I knew what that message was. It wasn't love. It was maintenance. It was her checking the structure, making sure the walls were still standing. And that's when it hit me. I had spent years believing the truth would surface if I stayed patient. But the truth doesn't surface on its own. It gets buried. Carefully. Repeatedly. With a smile. Unless someone decides to dig. So I kept digging. Not loudly. Not emotionally. Just consistently. Because in a world where people play dirty, the quiet man with a notebook is the one they should have been afraid of all along. And the deeper I went, the more I realized I wasn't dealing with betrayal. I was dealing with a plan. I didn't sleep much that week. Not because I was crying. Not because I was pacing the house like a man in a movie. I couldn't sleep because my brain wouldn't stop doing what it always does when something doesn't add up. It kept running the numbers. It kept replaying little moments. And every time I tried to tell myself, you're overreacting, I'd remember the pattern, the dates, the charges, the lies that were too clean to be accidental. On the third night, I sat in my home office with the lights off except for the desk lamp. The house was quiet in that unnatural way it gets when you're sharing space with someone and still feel completely alone. Lauren's side of the closet was still full. Her perfume bottle still sat on the bathroom counter, like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I opened my laptop again and pulled up the name of that firm from the bank statement. The Trust and Estate Office. I told myself I was just being careful. I told myself there had to be an innocent explanation. Then I did the thing I wish I'd done years earlier. I stopped asking what felt reasonable, and I started asking what was true. I checked our shared email archive first, not because I wanted to violate privacy, because we'd never had privacy. We'd had convenience, shared passwords, shared accounts, shared calendars. It's funny how trust looks romantic until it becomes evidence. I searched for the firm's name. 2 results. One was a generic newsletter. The other was an email forwarded to Lauren's personal inbox from her work address. The subject line was boring on purpose. Something like updated documents. Review. That's how you hide something in plain sight. You make it sound like paperwork no one wants to read. My finger hovered over the trackpad for a second longer than it should have. Not because I was scared of what I might find, because I already knew whatever was inside was going to force a decision. I opened it. There were attachments, PDFs, legal language, pages of it, and right there, near the top of one document, was my name. Ethan Cole, printed cleanly, spelled correctly, like it belonged there. I stared at it until my eyes went dry. I scrolled down. The document wasn't a love letter. It wasn't even about marriage. It was about responsibility, a trust arrangement, a structure, a mechanism. It referenced a minor beneficiary. It referenced long-term obligations. It referenced how funds would be managed in the event of separation. Separation. Not if. Not maybe. In the event of, I felt my stomach go cold. Not because I didn't understand the words, but because I understood the thinking behind them. This wasn't just betrayal. This was planning for after the betrayal. And here's the part that hit me hardest. It wasn't designed to punish me if I stayed. It was designed to trap me if I left. Because the document didn't read like something you sign out of love. It read like something you sign when people expect you to move on impulse. When people expect you to storm out, disappear, and let them write the story without you. I sat back in my chair and just listened to the house. The air conditioner clicking on, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft sound of my own breathing. In that moment, every movie instinct in me screamed one thing. Leave. Get out. Go to a hotel. Clear your head. But then another thought followed, quieter and sharper. If I leave, I lose position. Not emotionally. Legally. Because people don't talk about this part when they give advice online. They say, walk away. Protect your peace. And yes, peace matters. But peace doesn't pay lawyers. Peace doesn't rewrite paperwork. Peace doesn't undo a signature you didn't realize you were being pushed toward. In a crisis, the fastest decision is often the most expensive one. I finally understood something I used to judge other people for. When someone gets betrayed and they stay in the house, we call them weak. We assume they're begging. We assume they're hoping the other person will change. But staying isn't always begging. Sometimes staying is strategy. Sometimes staying is the only way to keep the ground under your feet while you figure out what's been built around you. Because the person who didn't break the marriage shouldn't be the one sprinting into the night like a criminal. That's the part nobody tells you. Manipulative people love it when you leave first. They love it because it gives them a clean story. He abandoned me. He ran. He couldn't handle it. And while you're out there trying to breathe, they're inside reorganizing the narrative and the paperwork. I thought about confronting Lauren right then. I imagined walking upstairs, holding the printed pages, demanding an explanation, and I could already hear what she'd say. Why are you snooping? Why are you acting crazy? That's not what it looks like. She wouldn't answer the question. She'd change the question. That's what skilled liars do. So I didn't go upstairs. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene. I printed the documents. I highlighted the lines that mattered. I wrote the date on the top right corner like I was filing a report. Then I did the most important thing I'd done in years. I decided not to move quickly. I decided to move correctly. That night, I didn't stay because I wanted her back. I stayed because I finally realized I was standing inside a trap that was built for the version of me who panics. And for the first time in my life, I refused to give them that version. 2 mornings later, I drove to work like nothing had happened. Same route, same gas station, same coffee that tastes like burnt optimism. I even waved at the security guard at the gate. That's the part people don't understand about betrayal like this. You don't explode right away. You split in half. One half of you keeps the world running. Bills, meetings, small talk. The other half quietly starts building a case. By the end of that week, I had a folder on my laptop that I didn't name Lauren. I didn't name it Marcus. I didn't name it anything emotional. I called it Clear Ground, because that's what I was trying to find. Solid ground. Facts that didn't move when somebody smiled and lied. It started simple. I pulled our bank statements going back 18 months, then 24, then 36. 3 years. I made a timeline on a legal pad. Not dramatic, just lines and dates. And the more I wrote, the more I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The lies weren't random. They were scheduled. There were payments that hit the same time every month. Hotel charges that always showed up on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. Transfers that were always for a work expense. Always under a certain amount, like someone had researched what looked normal. And then there were the gaps. Weeks where Lauren claimed she was swamped, yet her card barely moved. Weeks where she said she was traveling for the company. But her location history? Yes. I checked, never left the city. I didn't feel like a detective. I felt like a man reading his own life with the wrong subtitles. Because the story I'd been told didn't match the footage. I didn't confront her. I didn't demand her phone. I didn't start shouting questions at midnight. Not because I was scared. Because I finally understood something that should have been obvious when someone is manipulating you. They're prepared for your emotions. They're not prepared for your silence. Anger gives them something to work with. Tears give them a stage. But quiet forces them to stand alone in the spotlight. So I kept my voice steady. I kissed her forehead like I always did. I asked about her day like I always did. And I watched. That's all I did at first. Watch. Like I was seeing her for the first time. There were little things that I used to ignore because they were reasonable. Lauren would take a call outside and lower her voice. Reasonable. She'd start keeping her laptop angled away from me. Reasonable. She'd come home exhausted, drop her purse on the counter, and shower immediately. Reasonable. I had spent 3 years treating reasonable like proof. But reasonable is just a costume. A liar can wear it too. One night, she mentioned Marcus casually, like dropping a pebble into a lake and pretending there weren't ripples. We might have to fly out to Phoenix next month, she said. There's a big meeting. I nodded. Phoenix? Then I checked her calendar later. No Phoenix. No meeting. Just a 3-day block labeled client site. I stared at that phrase for a long time. Client site. It sounded clean, professional, boring. It was also the kind of label you use when you don't want anyone asking questions. 3 weeks later, I got a notification from the bank. A document request had been submitted online, not by me, not from my device. A request for trust-related paperwork, the same firm name, the same one from the statement. Wasn't a mistake. It wasn't spam. It had my information on it. My full name, my address, the last 4 digits of my social. It was clean enough to pass. It was dirty enough to scare me. That was the moment I stopped seeing this as an affair. Affairs are reckless. They're impulsive. They leave crumbs everywhere. This wasn't crumbs. This was architecture. Someone had drawn this up with rulers. And the deeper I looked, the more I realized something else. I wasn't the only one being managed. Marcus had patterns too. His assistant would confirm late meetings that didn't exist in the official schedule. He'd book private rooms at certain restaurants under a business account, and the company reimbursed it. Not all of it. Just enough to make it blend in. He wasn't just cheating with my wife. He was using his power like it was a shield. And Lauren was using my patience like it was a leash. I started saving everything. Screenshots, statements, copies of emails. I forwarded things to a separate account I'd created with a random name. I printed the critical pages and put them in a plain folder inside my trunk, under the spare tire compartment. I didn't do any of this because I wanted to win. I did it because I could feel the trap tightening. And I needed an exit that didn't rely on anyone believing my feelings. Feelings can be argued with. Facts can't. There's a question people like to ask when they hear a story like this. Why didn't you just leave? I used to think that was a strong question. Now, I think it's a naive one. Because when you leave without understanding the full structure, you don't escape. You just change locations, and the people who built the trap still control the outcome. That's when I started meeting with someone quietly. Not a private investigator. Not a guy with a trench coat. A lawyer. A calm, older man who didn't react to drama. He reacted to documents. I slid the folder across his desk. And he didn't say, "I'm sorry." He said, "How long has this been going on?" That question hit me harder than anything, because it forced me to say the number out loud. 3 years. 3 years of reasonable explanations. 3 years of me choosing patience over clarity. And as I said it, I realized something that made my throat tighten. The worst part wasn't that they lied. The worst part was how confident they were that I would never look, that I would keep being the good man who doesn't dig. The good man who doesn't make waves. The good man who thinks love means giving people the benefit of the doubt forever. My lawyer looked at me and said, "Do not confront anyone yet." And for the first time, that advice didn't feel like weakness. It felt like leverage, because that's the truth about people like Marcus. They don't fear your anger. They don't fear your heartbreak. They fear the moment you stop reacting and start recording. And I had reached that moment. I just didn't know yet what the biggest piece of the trap was. Not until I found the document with my name on it in the first place. And once you see your own name inside someone else's plan, you don't unsee it. You get quiet, you get careful, and you get ready. After my lawyer told me not to confront anyone, I went home and sat in my truck for a long time, engine off, hands on the steering wheel like I was trying to keep my life from sliding off the road. I stared at the house and realized something that made me feel stupid. Not because I didn't see the signs, but because I kept explaining them away. I used to think gaslighting was some dramatic thing, a villain twisting a mustache, rewriting reality out loud. But the version I lived through was quieter. It sounded like love. It sounded like reason. It sounded like me being the mature one. Lauren didn't have to convince me I was crazy. She only had to convince me I was overreacting. And if you're a decent man, if you're the kind of person who tries to keep the peace, that's an easy trap to fall into, because you don't want to be unfair. You don't want to accuse someone you love. You don't want to turn your home into a courtroom, so you swallow the discomfort. You call it patience. You call it trust. And one day you wake up and realize your patience wasn't a virtue anymore. It was a tool someone else was using. Looking back, there were phrases Lauren used that should have made me stop, not because they were obvious lies, because they were designed to make me doubt my own instincts. If I asked a simple question, "Hey, why was your phone off for 3 hours?" she wouldn't answer it. She'd reframe it. "Why are you tracking me?" If I mentioned a timeline, you said you were at the office, but your card was used across town, she wouldn't explain. She'd dismiss. "You're thinking too hard." If I told her something hurt something small, like how distant she'd been, she wouldn't sit with it. She'd flip it back on me. "You're so sensitive lately. That one is poison, because it makes you feel guilty for having a nervous system." And I didn't want to be the guy who needs reassurance. So I would apologize. Me. I would say, yeah, maybe I am stressed. Work's been a lot. And she'd relax. Not because she loved me, because the pressure was off. That's the first early sign people miss you start explaining your feelings more than you're being heard. You're always clarifying. Always trying to say it the right way. Like if you just choose the perfect words, the truth will finally land. But the truth isn't the problem. Control is. The second sign is when the timeline never quite matches. But every time you bring it up, you end up feeling like the difficult one. I can't tell you how many times I sat there thinking, maybe I remembered it wrong. Not because I have a bad memory, but because I didn't want conflict. So I gave her the benefit of the doubt, again, and again, and again. The third sign, this one hurts the most. You start collecting little details in your head, not to understand the relationship, but to defend yourself. You start replaying conversations like you're preparing for trial. You start remembering exact sentences, exact times, exact tones. Not because you're paranoid, because you've been trained to believe that your reality is negotiable. That's what gaslighting does. It doesn't destroy your intelligence. It erodes your trust in your own perception. And once that happens, you don't even need the other person to keep manipulating you. You do it to yourself. You start policing your own thoughts. You're being dramatic. Don't make a big deal. Maybe it's nothing. I used to wear that like a badge. I thought it made me stable. I thought it made me strong. But stability without truth isn't strength. It's just endurance. And there's a difference between being patient and being numb. There's a difference between being loyal and being exploited. That night, after I put my key in the door, Lauren called from the kitchen like everything was normal. Hey, babe, you hungry? And I almost answered the way I always did. Almost. But then I caught myself, not in a dramatic way, just a quiet moment where I realized I'd been living on autopilot. I walked in, kissed her cheek, and said, "Yeah, I'll eat in a minute." My voice didn't shake. I didn't accuse. I didn't test her. I just watched her face, and for a split second, just a split second, I saw it. That micro flinch people don't notice when they still believe. The tiny calculation behind the smile. Like she was always checking, is he calm? Is he clueless? Is he under control? That was my aha moment. Not the bank statements, not the emails, not even the trust paperwork. It was realizing that I had been managing her comfort more than she ever managed my pain. And I want you to hear this part clearly. Recognizing gaslighting isn't about revenge. It's not about becoming bitter. It's about refusing to repeat the same mistake with a different face. It's about knowing that love shouldn't require you to distrust yourself. A healthy relationship doesn't make you feel like you need evidence just to be taken seriously. And if you're watching this and thinking, yeah, I've heard those phrases before. If you've ever caught yourself apologizing for asking a simple question, if you've ever felt like you were losing your grip on what's real, you're not stupid, you're not weak, you're not crazy. You're probably just a good person who stayed patient a little too long. And the moment you stop negotiating with your own instincts, that's when the fog starts to lift. That's when you get your mind back. And that, more than anything, is where your freedom actually begins. I used to believe the law was a safety net. Like if the truth ever came out, the system would step in and make things fair. That's what a lot of good people believe. Because good people assume the world works the way their conscience works. But here's what I learned the hard way. The law doesn't rescue you just because you're right. The law protects what you can still prove, and what you haven't already surrendered. After that night, after the VIP room, after the paperwork with my name on it, my first instinct was to do what most men do when their world collapses. Leave. Sleep somewhere else. disappear for a few days and clear my head. I was seconds away from turning myself into the one who walked out, not because I was guilty, because I was hurt. And hurt makes you run. But my lawyer said something that snapped me out of the fog. He said, "Ethan, if you move out right now, don't expect the court to treat that like a romantic gesture. They treat it like a decision. A decision. That word hit different. Because when you're in shock, you think you're pausing the story. But the system hears you saying, 'I'm giving up my position.' So I stayed, not to beg, not to patch things up, not to punish anyone. I stayed because I finally understood something basic that nobody teaches decent men. In a crisis, boundaries aren't just emotional. They're practical. They're legal. They're your future." For the next few weeks, I lived like a man with 2 jobs. By day, I went to work like normal. By night, I quietly rebuilt the parts of my life I'd never thought I'd need to defend. I made a timeline, not a feelings timeline, a factual one. Dates, times, locations, who said what, and when. When Lauren started working late, when Marcus suddenly became a weekly topic at our dinner table, when the first unexplained charges appeared, when the baby's due date shifted by a couple days like it was nothing, because vague memories don't hold up. Details do. Then I pulled my financial records, not to become controlling, to become awake. I checked every joint account, every transfer, every auto payment I had ignored because I trusted my wife. I screenshotted statements the same day I found them, because things can disappear later. I didn't scream. I didn't confront. I didn't send paragraphs of rage that could be read back in court like I was unstable. I just documented. Quietly. Consistently. And the more I documented, the clearer it became. This wasn't one bad decision. This was a plan that depended on me reacting emotionally. Because if I blew up, they'd call me abusive. If I left, they'd call me absent. If I begged, they'd call me weak. And if I did nothing, they'd call me complicit. It was a trap built out of optics. So I stopped playing the optics game. I started playing the reality game. Here's the part most people don't want to hear. Sometimes the person who wronged you is still going to walk into court and act innocent. They'll cry, they'll smile, they'll say, "We just grew apart." And if you have nothing but heartbreak, you'll lose more than your marriage. You'll lose money, time, access, peace. Not because you're a bad person, because you showed up with feelings, and they showed up with a strategy. I'm not saying turn yourself into a paranoid accountant overnight. I'm not giving legal advice. I'm telling you what saved me from a second disaster after the first one. I did 3 things that kept me standing. First, I kept my feet planted. I didn't rush to leave the home and hand over the narrative. Second, I kept my records clean. Separate accounts where appropriate. Receipts, statements, copies of anything with my signature on it. Third, I stopped talking in emotions when the other side was operating in terms. I shifted from "I feel" to "here's what happened." That shift changes everything. Because manipulators don't fear your anger. They fear your clarity. And clarity is built from facts. I used to think boundaries were something you said. Like, "I won't accept this." But in situations like mine, boundaries are also something you do. Where you live, what you pay, what you sign, what you stop funding, who you stop protecting. And that's the line most decent people cross without realizing it. They keep paying. They keep covering. They keep being the bigger person until the damage becomes permanent. So when I say, the law doesn't stand with the person who's right, I'm not being cynical. I'm being honest. The law tends to stand with the person who's still standing. The person who didn't panic and burn their own life down while the other side watched. The person who stayed calm long enough to keep their future intact. That's what this story became for me. Not revenge, not even justice. A wake-up call. A reminder that being good is not the same as being protected. And if you are in a situation right now where everything feels like it's falling apart, listen to me. Don't make your next decision fast just because your heart is screaming. Make it slow. Make it solid. Make it so that a year from now, you can look back and say, I didn't just survive the betrayal. I survived what came after it. 2. 3 months after everything collapsed, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't missing Lauren. I was missing the version of myself that used to feel safe. The man who believed if you worked hard, kept your promises, and stayed quiet, life would stay in order. That man didn't die overnight. He just got tired. And once the paperwork was signed and the house was quiet, there was this strange emptiness that hit me in the chest. Not loneliness, more like withdrawal. Like my nervous system had been living on high alert for so long, it didn't know what to do with peace. The first week, I woke up at 4:17 every morning, same minute. I'd stare at the ceiling and mentally rehearse conversations I was never going to have again. What I should have said. What I should have noticed. How long? How long? Even when you win, your mind still tries to drag you back into the fight. So I did something small, something ordinary. I started going to the same diner every Saturday morning. Not because the food was great, because it was simple. No chandeliers, no VIP rooms, no hidden language. Just a cracked leather booth. Coffee that tasted like it had been boiled in an old sock. And a waitress who called everyone Han. I'd sit there with my phone face down, hands around the mug, and I'd just exist. That was new for me. For years, my life had been one long performance of being useful, being patient, being understanding, being the guy who could carry everything without dropping it. And when you stop performing, you find out who you are when nobody's asking anything from you. That's when I met Emily. It wasn't a movie moment. No slow motion. No perfect lighting. It was actually kind of embarrassing. I reached for the napkin dispenser at the same time she did, and it tipped over and spilled half the napkins onto the floor. I muttered, "Sorry," and I crouched down to pick them up. She crouched down too, and before I could say anything else, she smiled and said, "Don't worry. I do this like once a week. It's basically my hobby." That line made me laugh. A real laugh. The kind that comes from your stomach, not your mouth. And it startled me because I hadn't laughed like that in a long time. We talked for maybe 5 minutes. Nothing heavy. Nothing dramatic. She asked what I did for work. I asked where she was from. She told me she'd moved out to the desert for a fresh start after a job burnout. And when she said it, there was no pity in her voice. No poor me, just honesty. Like she wasn't trying to sell me a version of herself. That's what stood out. Because I'd lived with someone who could turn a lie into a lullaby. Emily didn't do that. She didn't perform. She didn't probe. She didn't try to fix me or pull a story out of me like it was entertainment. She just let silence sit on the table without rushing to fill it. A week later, I saw her again. Same diner, same time, different booth. She waved like we were already friends, and something in me relaxed before I could even think about it. Because there was no game to win, no role to play, no invisible test I had to pass. We didn't talk about my marriage at first. That might sound strange, but it mattered. Because my whole life had started to feel like a case file, evidence, timelines, facts, and I didn't want my healing to become another project. One morning, she noticed I always sat facing the door. Always, even when the diner was half empty. She didn't call me paranoid. She didn't tease me. She just said quietly, "You look like someone who's been on guard for a long time." I froze. Not because she was wrong, because she named it without trying to own it. I took a breath and said, "Yeah, I have." And that was it. No follow-up interrogation. No sympathy performance. She just nodded like she understood the sentence for what it was. A truth, not an invitation to control me. That's when I realized what clear ground actually means. It's not a new relationship. It's not a new city. It's not even a clean legal outcome. Clear ground is when you stop living like you're in a courtroom. When you stop trying to prove you're worthy of being loved. When you stop needing the other person to understand what they did. Because deep down, you already understand. Clear ground is quiet. It's boring in the best way. It's paying your bills and sleeping through the night. It's laughing at spilled napkins. It's choosing people who don't require you to shrink, or perform, or bleed just to be allowed in the room. For a long time, I thought peace would feel like victory, like fireworks. Like watching the people who hurt you finally admit they were wrong. But peace doesn't feel like winning. Peace feels like not caring who's keeping score. And that's how I knew I was finally out. Not because Lauren lost, not because Marcus fell, but because one day I walked into that diner, sat down, took a sip of coffee, and realized I wasn't bracing for anything anymore. If you're watching this and your stomach keeps tightening for no clear reason, I want you to hear me. You're not crazy. You're not too sensitive. And you're not weak for still loving someone who keeps hurting you in small, explainable ways. That's how it works. It's never one big lie that breaks you. It's 1,000 tiny moments where you feel something is off. And then you talk yourself out of it because you're trying to be mature, because you're trying to keep the peace, because you're the one who always carries things. I used to think being a good person meant giving people the benefit of the doubt until the very end. But here's the truth. I had to learn the hard way. Being kind doesn't mean being available for endless sacrifice. Being loyal doesn't mean staying in a story where your reality is constantly questioned. And being the strong one doesn't mean bleeding quietly, so everyone else can stay comfortable. If you're in the middle of it right now, don't make your next decision out of panic. Don't blow up. Don't run. Don't hand over your position just because your heart can't take the air in the room. Slow down. Write things down. Look at the timeline. Look at the money. Look at what's actually happening, not what you wish was happening. Because the people who benefit from confusion will always push you to react fast. And the moment you stop reacting, you start seeing clearly. You don't need to become ruthless. You just need a system. And if this story hit a nerve, comment where you're watching from. Share it with someone who's been doubting themselves in silence. And subscribe. Because sometimes the most life-changing thing you can hear is simply this. You're not alone, and you're not wrong for wanting your life back.